One of the most common things we hear from blended family couples, and honestly, it's said in almost exactly these words: I want to make sure my spouse is taken care of. I also don't want my kids to lose out. What makes this statement hard is that it can seem these two things are in conflict. Do I have to choose who I am protecting? Today, Jerry and I want to walk through something that changes conversation entirely. There's a planning tool that, when structured correctly, lets you take care of your spouse and protect your children without having to pit one against the other. We're talking about life insurance. In a blended family, the right structure can be a difference between a peaceful transition and a family conflict.
April, let me ask you the question that I think is sitting underneath all of this. Why is it that in a blended family specifically, life insurance becomes such an important part of the plan, where in a traditional family, it might just be about income replacement?
Why does life insurance play a bigger role in blended family planning than it does in a traditional family situation? In a traditional family, when the first spouse passes, everything typically flows through to the surviving spouse and then eventually to their shared children. Everyone is rowing in the same direction. The natural order of inheritance tends to work out. In a blended family, that's often not true. You may have children from a prior relationship who are watching to see whether they'll be protected. You may have a surviving spouse who has their own children and their own priorities. If the only plan is leave everything to my spouse, the kids from the first marriage frequently end up with nothing, not out of malice, but because no structure was in place to prevent it. Life insurance changes the math. It can create a separate pool of assets that goes directly to your children outside of what your spouse inherits. So instead of a zero sum situation where more for one means less for the other, there's enough for everyone.
The framing, the life insurance removes the zero sum problem, is really the key insight here. So let me take us into the actual structures, because I think this is where people's eyes glaze over, and I want to make it concrete. The first structure worth knowing about is called a second to die policy. It's also called a survivorship policy. Here's how it works. Instead of insuring one person, this policy covers two people, typically a married couple. The death benefit pays out when the second spouse passes away, not the first. So the surviving spouse is taken care of during their lifetime, and when they pass, the policy pays out, typically to a trust that then distributes to the children from the first marriage. This type of policy tends to be more affordable than two separate policies because the insurance company is covering a longer combined timeline. And for blended families, it's specifically designed for this situation. You want your spouse taken care of, and you want your kids protected after your spouse is gone.
Jerry, what about a family that doesn't want to wait? Where the kids from a prior relationship are worried about what happens if just the first spouse passes away?
What if the concern is protecting children from a prior relationship when the first spouse passes, not just after both spouses are gone? In that case, you're usually looking at a different structure, a traditional term or permanent policy on the first spouse's life, with the death benefit going into a trust for those children. That trust is funded at death. The surviving spouse doesn't control it, and the children's inheritance is protected regardless of what the surviving spouse does with the rest of the estate. Now, this is where something called an ILIT, an Irrevocable Life Insurance Trust, sometimes comes into the picture. The trust owns the policy, the trust is the beneficiary, and because the insured person doesn't own the policy themselves, the death benefit may pass outside of the taxable estate. There can be real planning advantages there, depending on the family situation. I want to be clear, this is not something to set up without professional guidance. An attorney needs to draft it correctly. The premiums need to be funded through the trust in a very specific way. But the concept is straightforward. It's a way to make sure a life insurance benefit reaches exactly who you intended in exactly the structure you intended.
One thing worth saying here, we see this come up. Sometimes one spouse is much more concerned about protecting their kids than the other. That's why these conversations can get emotionally charged. What we've seen work is when couples approach it from the same starting point. We both want to be fair to everyone in this family, not your kids versus my kids. It's our family. And what does a fair plan look like for everyone? Life insurance framed this way isn't a concession, it's a tool that makes fairness possible.
And that's the peace treaty framing we use. It's not that anyone is negotiating against each other, it's that the right financial structure removes the conflict before it ever starts. So, April, let me bring it back to the practical question. If someone watching this thinks, okay, this sounds like something we should look at, what are the first questions they should be thinking through?
What are the first questions a blended family should be asking when they think about whether life insurance fits into their estate plan? A few that we walk through with families. How much are you each bringing into the marriage, and what do you each want to happen to it? Do you have children from prior relationships? And what are your intentions for them? Does your surviving spouse have their own resources, or would they need what you've built together to live on? And how does your life insurance fit with the rest of your estate plan? Your trust, your beneficiary designations, your will? These aren't simple questions, but they are the right starting point. Life insurance doesn't exist in a vacuum. It works as part of a coordinated plan. And whether it's the right tool and which structure makes sense depends on the answer to those questions and many more. If this is a conversation your family needs to have, we encourage you to not put it off. These decisions get harder, not easier, as time goes on. There's a link in the description if you'd like to connect with us at White Oak Planning.